Lakes coastal communities.
This meeting is being recorded.
This is the third installment in a four-part webinar series presented by the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus, examining some of the critical policy issues related to the Great Lakes. My name is Mike McCabe, and I am the director of the Midwestern Office of the Council of State Governments. One of our roles here at CSG is to provide staff support to the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus. And on behalf of all of the caucus members, we are pleased to welcome you this morning. Before we get started, let's briefly review a couple of items. First, a reminder that today's webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be made available on the caucus website. Second, we ask that you please mute your audio to help reduce background noise. And third, we hope that this will be an interactive session, so please be ready to participate in the discussion or ask questions following our guest presentations. And you are certainly welcome to make use of the chat feature as we go. Many of you have been active in the work of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus, but as a reminder to all, and for the benefit of those of you who may be joining us for the first time, the caucus is a binational, nonpartisan network of state and provincial legislators representing the 8 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces that share the Great Lakes Basin. The caucus is dedicated to promoting the protection and restoration of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River and is led by an executive committee that includes legislators from every state and province in the region. The current chair of the caucus is Illinois Representative Robin Gable, and the vice chair is Minnesota Representative Jennifer Schultz. Membership in the caucus is free and open to any legislator in the region who wishes to participate. You can find a list of current members on our website, greatlakeslegislators.org, and if you wish to join us, you can sign up online as well. Today's webinar will focus on climate resilience in coastal communities and will include an overview of the challenges and science related to this subject, as well as a look at some of the resources that legislators wishing to learn more about these issues may wish to be familiar with. We'll also hear about some of the climate resilience work that is already underway and being led by 2 other groups here in the Great Lakes region. As you'll see, we are fortunate to be joined by 3 outstanding guest speakers. But first, I'm pleased to introduce to you 2 members of the GLLC who will take it from here and lead this morning's webinar. Serving as our moderators today are Illinois Senator Laura Fine and Minnesota Senator Dave Senjum. Senators Fine and Senjum are both members of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus Executive Committee, and they also currently serve as co-chairs of the GLLC's Burkholz Institute Steering Committee, which will help guide the development this year of an in-depth caucus initiative focusing on climate resilience in coastal communities. With thanks to both of them for their leadership, I'll turn it over now to Illinois Senator Laura Fine. Senator Fine.
Laura, you're muted.
Thank goodness it's Friday, right? So welcome everybody, and thank you for being here. As Mike said, that this is part of a series of webinars, and the webinars are recorded. So if you are not able to watch them in present time, you can get the opportunity to see them later. Today, we're going to hear from 3 incredible speakers. After all of their presentations, we're going to open it up for questions and answers. But in the meantime, you can always put your question in chat if you do have a question. With that, I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Senator David Senjum, to welcome you as well.
Thank you, Senator Fine, and welcome to all. I'm sitting here in my office in St. Paul, Minnesota, just keenly interested in what we're going to hear today. Yes, we have 3 outstanding speakers. Their credentials are just terribly impressive, and I'm sure their conversations with us will be as well. We'll have time at the end for questions, by the way. I think you know that, but we apparently, frankly, would expect it. So looking forward to a good morning, so to speak, with respect to some great information, great speakers on a very, very timely topic. So, so I'll turn it back to you, Laura, and let's get the program going.
Great. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker today. Our first speaker this morning is Mr. Brandon Crumweedy. He is a physical scientist at NOAA's Office for Coastal Management located in Duluth, Minnesota. Brandon's work is focused on utilizing remote sensing and geospatial data for analysis to address coastal and nearshore issues in the Great Lakes and to provide meaningful and timely information to coastal partners. He previously worked for the National Weather Service, the World Bank, the University of Montana, and also served in the U.S. Army Space and Missile Defense Command, where he first learned how to use satellites for remote sensing applications. Brandon has a Master's of Science in Geography from the University of Montana and received his Bachelor of Science in Geography with minors in Geology and International Studies from Bemidji State University in northern Minnesota. He's here today to provide us with an overview of the important challenges and issues related to climate change in coastal communities and the importance of working to promote coastal climate resilience across the Great Lakes region. Thank you, Brandon, for being here today, and take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Senator Fine. And thank you, everybody, for the time to present today. So I will try and share my screen here. And if I can just get an affirmative once the screen share is available to everybody.
It's good.
Looks good, Brandon.
All right. Thank you very much. So yes, my title today is Improving Climate Resilience in Great Lakes Coastal Communities. And as the welcome there in my introduction, this is something that we've been working on quite extensively in the Great Lakes. Just want to provide a brief intro to what NOAA is, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. A lot of folks are familiar with the National Weather Service and all the warnings and weather information that they provide, but there are a lot of different line offices within NOAA. And I actually reside within the National Ocean Service, which can be a surprise to a lot of folks when they think National Ocean Service, Great Lakes, but what does this all mean? And I actually reside within a office within the National Ocean Service, the Office for Coastal Management. And so hopefully that helps to provide a little bit of structure as I present the rest of the information today. But first, I want to kick it off with a quote from Dr. Spinrad. He is the administrator for NOAA. And this was just recently released in relation to the recently released IPCC climate change report. And I'm just going to read it out here. It is my goal to ensure that our agency is helping these decision makers build a climate-ready nation that strengthens our resilience to climate change, which helps to protect lives, lifestyles, and livelihoods. After all, if we hope to have a prosperous society and economy tomorrow, it must begin with climate action and adaptation plans made today. And that's words that resonate with all of the NOAA offices in providing that needed information. And I did a quick, Friday fun fact here. And what's really interesting is the NOAA services alone help to support over 1/3 of the US GDP. And that again resonates with the messaging here with Dr. Spinrad and the efforts within NOAA. As I mentioned, working with the Office for Coastal Management, the legislation that helps to drive what we do day in and day out is the Coastal Zone Management Act. And in response to a lot of the activities that were happening back in the early 70s with things like development along the shorelines that was unregulated, natural disasters like hurricanes, and then man-made disasters, thinking about what kicked off the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, the administration within NOAA said, let's move forward with making sure that we have the resources to manage our coastal locations. And this does include the Great Lakes. And so the goal of the Coastal Zone Management Act is help to preserve, protect, develop, and where possible, restore or enhance the resources of the nation's coastal zone. And this year actually marks the 50th year anniversary of the passage of the Coastal Zone Management Act. NOAA's Office for Coastal Management mission is to inspire and influence a broad base of leaders, citizens, coastal management professionals, and to ensure healthy coastal ecosystems, resilient coastal communities, and vibrant, sustainable coastal economies. And our principles that help to carry that forward is that we are a very much partner and user-focused organization providing high-quality programs, products, and services to our coastal communities. And one of the models that we like to think about day in and day out as well is we think nationally, but we act and empower locally with the resources that we provide through NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. And what I mean by that is we work very close with a lot of state organizations, both at the federal, state, and local levels. And in fact, the Coastal Zone Management Program within the Great Lakes depends on the partnership of the Coastal Zone Management Programs within each state. We also have 2 national estuarine research reserves that help to provide additional science in regards to natural ecosystems. And those are located in the Superior, Wisconsin location, as well as just outside of Sandusky, Ohio. And we're getting underway with the release of a new national estuarine research reserve in Green Bay. And so it's through these partnerships that a lot of our work is carried out. The states are responsible for implementation, and NOAA's Office for Coastal Management provides the technical assistance to assist with that implementation. And it does require a large partnership because it is a big challenge when you think about the coastal management perspective, both in terms of the communities. As we all know, shorelines are naturally dynamic, and that's due to the physical processes that interact within those environments. And a lot of people think, well, no, it's only about commerce, right? But no, it's also the natural resources within those areas. And so, we like to think about making sure that everything is in balance. And sometimes, as we're all aware, things do get off balance. And so that's where we try to help and assist with making sure that we can improve coastal communities and improve their resiliency to climate change in the future. So I'm going to touch on today just a few things here in regards to the climate trend. I know when I talked with Mike prior to setting up this meeting with all of you in attendance and presenting, he wanted me to help set the stage. And so I'm going to use a few slides to do that. But then also, as we've all seen over the last decade, there's a lot of complexity in regards to water levels. In 2013, 2014, we were seeing near record water levels that were low or well below the long-term average. And just recently, we're coming out of a period of record high water levels. And our coastal communities are really trying to figure out, what are we supposed to respond to? Is it the low water levels? Is it the high water levels? And what I want to say is it's a range of water levels that we have to account for. And then I'm going to talk briefly too on the physical impacts to our shorelines, but also the economic and social impacts that we see with these environmental changes in our coastal communities. So let's look at some of the regional climate trends. And one of the more staggering is just in regards to the amount of precipitation that we're seeing within our region alone. When compared to the rest of the continental US, we've seen a 42% increase in our heavy precipitation events and the intensity of those events and frequency of those events here in the Northeast and the Midwest climate regions. And, when we think about this is attributed to this recent period of high water levels with the increase in precipitation, flooding events. Notable events that have occurred in the Great Lakes region include the flooding that has occurred recently in the Detroit metro area, in northern Wisconsin, and then again, the flooding event in 2012 that impacted the Duluth Superior Twin Ports area as well. We've also seen a notable increase in temperatures across the region. And for most of the Great Lakes region, we've seen approximately a 1 to 2 degree Fahrenheit increase for the last century alone. And so when we start thinking about climate change, and the influx of people into our coastal communities, how do we deal with this heat? How do we deal with changes in precipitation? Changes in ice cover has a strong impact to our coastal communities as well. And so what I want to highlight here is, we have a lot of changes that are occurring. While we've been talking about precipitation and temperature, what's really staggering is to see the number of billion-dollar disaster events that have also increased from 1980 to 2021 alone. And so the term resilience, if you were to look at this, and I put a little slide here showing the term resilience and its growth from 1980 to present as well. And you can see the correlation here between these billion-dollar disasters and why we need to be thinking about resiliency moving forward into the future. So with that increased precipitation and changes in water levels, it's really complex. And to really dive into it, we require a lot of observations. And so working with the Canadians, we've established a water level monitoring station network across the Great Lakes Basin to inform what those changes in the coastal nearshore environments look like with regards to water levels. And for each of the lakes, you'll notice that the distribution of those observations aren't necessarily equal. In some locations, like the connecting channel between Lake Huron and Lake Erie, we have a very dense array of water level monitoring stations. But in other parts of the Great Lakes, for example, in Lake Superior, there are only really 4 sites that help with understanding the lake-wide average water levels. But we know that this is not representing the true picture of what our coastal communities are experiencing. I believe that a lot of people have seen these graphs either in our newspapers or online or through various news outlets, the fluctuations in water levels within each of the basins. And so what I'll highlight is, starting again in 2013, 2014, in this last decade, we've seen this experience or rise in water levels within each of the basins. And of course, what's nice to finally see is those water levels are starting to drop back down. And in some cases, we've already gone down below the long-term average, which is this red line for some of these basins, or coming close to it. While this helps to give us a general picture at the lake scale, it doesn't really provide the complexity of what we're seeing at the coastal community scale. And what I mean by this is if we were to look at each of these individual lakes, and this is, I'm sorry for a little bit of a science lesson, I guess, on a Friday morning, but what I want to highlight here is how it's important to get the right data to our coastal communities. Looking at Lake Superior alone, we've seen a minimum water level of 182.7 meters, a maximum water level of 183.91, but these are based off of the monthly averages for each of the lakes. And again, you can see that between these two values, we've seen a difference of about 3.9 feet or 1.19 meters. However, if you look at these values compared to individual locations across the Great Lakes, you'll notice, for example, in Duluth, Minnesota, we've actually experienced a range closer to almost 6-foot change in water levels when we think about the absolute range between the lowest water levels and the highest water levels from low water data. And so for a coastal community, if they're looking only at 3.9 feet of water level change, when really they're experiencing close to 6-foot change of water levels, it's how do you build to accommodate these changes in that range of water levels? And where this really stood out is in the 2019 storm event that hit Duluth in October. And so if we looked at the long-term average, it sits here at this yellow line. This is the water levels that were measured at Duluth in 2019. October 1985 is what is referred to as the long-term average record high for water levels in Lake Superior. And you'll notice that this event alone was over a foot more in terms of the water level. And this is the static water level as measured at the gauging station. And for a community to understand what's happening here, I thought that, we didn't hit these record high water levels. Much of the year, Duluth was actually at or above the recorded high water level for Lake Superior. And when you look at that particular event alone, we saw waves 14 to 18 feet coming in from the northeast. And what we saw within that period of that storm event was a change of 15 inches in water levels in 30 hours. And for 24 hours of that event, it was basically like a ripsaw, just continuing to pound the shoreline with that increased water and wave action for 24 hours. And so when you think about these storm events and what's happening to our coastal communities, it's important to look at the local data and informing decisions on how to become more resilient. And so we can quickly, oops, sorry, that didn't mean to go to the actual gauge. You can look at it again, for example, here in Lake Michigan, the difference in water levels as reported at the monthly scale and for the basin as a whole is 6.33 feet. But a place like Calumet Harbor, Illinois, is actually experiencing close to 9-foot change in water levels. We can look at Lake Huron. And again, Harbor Beach is the reference station or the master gauge station for both Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. They're treated as one system. And again, if they're only showing a difference of 6.33 feet, but Essexville, Michigan is experienced an absolute range of water levels from 11 feet. And Erie, it's really interesting because of the satiation effects that we experience in this particular lake. And so when we look at the average water levels and the differences there of only 6.43 feet, but we see a community like Toledo, Ohio here that has actually experienced a range of water levels closer to over 14 feet. This is what is made it very challenging for our coastal communities to understand, what do we build to? How do we become more resilient with these changes in water levels? And in particular, what was really interesting in one instance is that while one location in Lake Erie was experiencing its record high, the other location within the same date and time, and that's actually here between Buffalo, New York, where its maximum was recorded on January 30th. But then you look at Toledo, its record low was also January 30th. This is in regards to a satiation effect or a coastal storm that actually pushed the water to hit Buffalo in 2008 and drew down quite a bit of water in Toledo and Fairport locations as well. And so the dynamic nature of these systems makes it very challenging for our coastal communities to understand, what do we build to? How do we become more resilient to these types of storm events? And then again, in Lake Ontario, what I will say here is you'll notice that the difference actually says 7.12 feet. And the absolute, that again, these are US stations. This is due to the fact that this is bringing in a lot of the Canadian side of the lake information and data into understanding water level changes. So what impacts do we see from these changes in water levels and these storm events? And a lot of these that I'm going to be highlighting today are actually associated with periods of high water levels, but there are also things that are impacted with periods of low water levels. So with the high water levels, we see a lot with regards to coastal flooding, obviously a lot of shoreline erosion, as well as sediment deposition that occurs. We see increased sediment transport in the nearshore and littoral area. The reason that's important is when you think about all of the dredging requirements for our harbors and ports across the Great Lakes region, and the Army Corps of Engineers having to move that sediment out of the way to ensure that commerce can occur in those harbors. We also see alterations to streams and river mouths that can impact aquatic habitat. We see a loss of coastal terrestrial and wetland habitat as well, with wetland areas being flooded out, but then no longer being able to reestablish themselves over a period of high water levels. And then again, we see the impacts when storms move through the areas. When you have high water levels and then bring a storm event into the location like we did in 2008, you definitely see our coastal areas being severely impacted by one single event alone. When we think about low water levels, yes, we do see some positive things there in terms of the expansion of coastal wetlands, but the negative there too is on our shipping industry. When water levels drop, we know that commerce cannot be as successful as it can be when water levels remain at average or at above average. But again, those are the things that we can physically see. When we see the erosion that's occurring along our shorelines, our beaches disappearing, but there are economic and social impacts as well. The damage to coastal infrastructure that we see, there's a cost associated with that. And how do we repair it? Do we wait to hold on to doing anything to it? Or do we need to be retreating from that as well? We've seen a lot of flooded marinas and docks, so people not being able to go out and recreate on the lake. And so that has had a negative impact to the marinas and the marine economy in that regard. We've also seen a lot of hazards to navigation. When trees erode and fall into the lakes, or other material is transported into the lakes, those can be a hazard to recreational boaters, but also to our larger shipping commerce as well. We have seen the shrinkage of beaches for recreational use. What used to be, 100 yards of sand beach for people to play on narrowed down to only 10 feet or no beach at all for them to recreate on as well. And of course, we've definitely seen a lot of loss and damage to private property. And a lot of people are resorting to, means to try and protect their shoreline that may not be the right way of protecting their shoreline as well. Seeing cars thrown in to protect their shorelines, concrete and rubble that ends up actually being detrimental to their neighbor that might be further down the shore in that regard as well. And then two, seeing this time and time again, there's that mental distress that's caused by environmental change, which is known as nostalgia. And so a lot of this, when we talk to our coastal communities, is this isn't what I remember. This isn't my happy place anymore. I don't want to be around this. And that's really sad to hear that people are starting to withdraw from our coastal areas because of these changes that we see. Here's just one example of how quickly or how much change has been occurring as we start to measure this with a lot of our remote sensing, GIS, and other data sets available to us. This is a project that we're working on at Illinois Beach State Park, where they've experienced a large amount of coastal erosion. And so what I want to highlight here are a couple of areas. In 2008 imagery, you can see these two locations along the shoreline. And within 10 years, close to almost 200 feet of shoreline has been eroded landward from this particular location. In fact, since 2018, I can acknowledge that this roadway has actually now also been impacted and is no longer usable in this regard. And it's not just what we see along our shoreline that's being changed, but also what's happening in the water as well. The image that you see on the far right here actually is capturing the changes in elevation and bathymetry between 2008 and 2018 as well. And any of the areas that you see are actually where erosion has occurred along the shoreline. But then the blue areas actually represent where sediment or material has actually been deposited. And so we can see actually where some of the beach nourishment activities that were put in place here at Illinois Beach to protect the shoreline have actually eroded and been entrained in littoral sediment transport and can have an impact further down the shoreline. The other thing that was interesting when we were looking at this data is you can actually see here this round circular linear feature. This is actually a roadway that existed along the shoreline back in the 1970s. And during the high water periods in the mid 80s actually caused a lot of erosion. So we already see roads that were part of everyday life in the 70s about over 100 yards to 200 yards offshore and sitting under water at the moment. So there are a lot of resources that we're making available to our Great Lakes coastal communities, and I want to highlight just a few of those. And this is something that I know when Mike reached out, he's like, "Hey, we just heard about the coastal flood exposure mapper. Can you explain and elaborate on other resources available to coastal communities?" And so one of the first places we point a lot of people to is NOAA's Digital Coast. And as it says, it is just more than data here that you can find. We offer a lot of different data sets, tools, trainings, and also opportunities to learn from other coastal communities about their efforts and adaptation strategies that they're working on to improve coastal resiliency. In regards to the data that we make available for the Great Lakes region, a lot of that includes coastal elevation and LiDAR data. And you can see an example of this being used in the upper right here, where we're looking at nearshore bathymetry and the slopes associated with that bathymetry to look at wave runoff in areas that might be inundated during the next coastal storm. We also provide a lot of land cover data going back to 1975 in the Great Lakes to 2016. And we're actually making some steps forward in the upcoming years to go from a very coarse resolution product at 30 meters down to a high resolution product that can be used at the project level scale for a lot of our coastal communities. We also do shoreline classification, and I'm going to highlight that data set here in a little bit. And we also collect and disseminate a lot of imagery to support our coastal communities. And an example of this is in the lower right, where we've done some hyperspectral imagery data collection to support coastal tribal partners in understanding the distribution of wild rice in the coastal areas as a way to understand food sovereignty for coastal indigenous communities. And as of it stands today, there are over 3,000 various data sets on Digital Coast that can help to support our understanding of coastal resiliency. One of the recent data sets that we put out in 2019 was the U.S. Great Lakes Hardened Shoreline Classification data set. And what this really helped us to understand is what is the composition and makeup of our shorelines in the Great Lakes region. And so looking at our shorelines, you can see that a good chunk of them, close to over 20% are artificial, or where we've gone in and hardened our shorelines within the Great Lakes. So over 1/5 of that has been hardened or man alternated. We have just under 20% that remain as wetlands. The other big majority is our fine sediment beaches, so the sandy beaches that you find in Lake Michigan and other locations within the Great Lakes. But then you can also see too, elevated shorelines to include our bluffs, banks, and low plains. The coarse sediment beaches like the rocky cobble beaches you find along the North Shore of Minnesota and Michigan. And then again, bedrock and other material that make up our shorelines in the Great Lakes. And what's nice about this data set is not only is it providing a quantitative way of understanding our shorelines, but also seeing it spatially in the distribution across the Great Lakes. And so looking at our artificial or hardened shoreline structures that are in place, you can see where the highest densities of those have been applied, including Lakes Ontario, Lake Erie, extending up towards Lake Huron, but then also the southern portion of Lake Michigan and in the Green Bay area as well. And again, a lot of this is associated with our marine commerce, including breakwalls, jetties, and other structures, but also protection that's been put in place to protect private property as well. The other thing that we've done with this data set is actually gone in and look at the condition of those structures and understanding, where do things currently sit in the construction and how quickly do these need to be replaced. This data set was created in partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers so that they could get a better understanding of how structures across Great Lakes Basin are distributed, but also where do they need to be focusing in on, with shorelines that are currently classified as poor quality or in need of replacement. You'll see that the majority of the shorelines, or the artificial shorelines in the Great Lakes, are of moderate quality. So they're good for another 15 to 30 years. But there are these that are already starting to fail or and should be addressed really quickly. And then you'll also see too that we do have over a quarter still in good condition, meaning they'll last for 30 plus years into the future. And high quality means that they're already at that 30 to 50 year mark as well. And so this has been very useful for the Army Corps to understand, again, which project areas should be addressed, but then also helping us to think about alternative solutions, including nature-based infrastructure. And, for example, switching out a riprap wall and putting in something that helps protect, but yet also provide habitat, either fish habitat, like offshore breakwaters, or other bioswales and green infrastructure to protect shorelines. When we look at our beaches and the distribution, over 16% of the Great Lakes is classified as fine sediment beaches. And the reason that we're really interested in these are the locations that are very dynamic and susceptible to changes in water levels, because that sediment can be easily transported, entrained, and moved through littoral or longshore drift. And again, it's no surprise, hopefully, to folks on the call, Lake Michigan is the king here in regards to the fine sediment beaches. But it also provides a challenge because we know that the sediment's moving through these systems. And again, it doesn't just stay in Wisconsin, but can have an impact to Illinois and Indiana. And similarly, in the other lakes, understanding, this cross-boundary transport of sediment and how it could have a positive or negative impact on habitat and the quality of life for coastal communities downstream from that sediment transport. And then wetlands. We do have almost 1/5 of the Great Lakes shoreline still classified as wetlands. And the importance of these is, they can act as those sponges with these changes in water levels. But as we said, if we have a period of high water levels that exist for quite some time, we actually end up losing these wetlands. And again, the importance of these provide habitat to the surrounding areas in which they are located, as well as in some regards can help it to act as the kidneys of the Great Lakes in helping to store some of the contaminants, but then also thinking about blue carbon and the sequestration of carbon moving forward. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the tools today as well. And one of the tools that we're really excited about in the Great Lakes today is the Coastal Flood Exposure Mapper. This is a tool that's actually existed with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management for quite some time. But just recently, we were able to push out data for the Great Lakes region so that people can understand, what's in the potential impact zones of any coastal inundation or flooding. And so this is just one example. There are several different data sets, and I'm not going to go through them all today here. But what this allows you to do is look at the combination of the coastal flood hazard composite data layer, which looks at the 1 to 3 foot rise in water levels, as well as the FEMA flood zones. And then you can combine that with other data. In this case, you can see development patterns, basically areas where have been developed since 1996, and the potential intersection of those locations. And this can help to inform coastal communities on deciding, this is where we shouldn't be building up, or we should have setbacks or develop ordinances to protect open space lands within these locations to make us more resilient to flooding and future climate change scenarios and outcomes. And again, this is just one data set. Another one that's really interesting here is actually when you combine this data with potential pollution sources. And this helps to identify those areas that have been identified as brownfield properties, hazardous waste sites, Superfund sites, or locations where toxic chemicals can be generated. And this example here is actually in Monroe along the River Raisin. And you can see the impacts or those sites that are located within the flood area here as well. And again, this presentation will be shared out. And if you click on each of these maps, you will be taken to the exact map that you see on the screen here to allow further exploration of these data sets. Another tool that we released in 2014 that has seen a lot of praise is NOAA's Lake Level Viewer. And this tool was actually developed to support a need that we heard in the Great Lakes in understanding which areas will be impacted in the future with changes in water levels. In 2014, it was, which areas may be exposed when water levels drop. And so that's what sets this tool apart from our other tool, the Sea Level Rise Viewer, and that not only do we see a +6 foot change in water levels, but what would we see with a -6 foot change in water levels as well. And one example where this was really useful was in 2019, that previous storm that I mentioned, in that we wanted to see what water levels might have looked like if we would have gone another foot or two above the long-term average. And so here you can actually see where water levels were set to +3 feet above the long-term average. And you can actually see where coastal inundation is occurring within the Duluth area. And what was really interesting is during that 2019 storm event, we actually did hear about the flooding that was occurring along Minnesota Point here as well. We also have the data access viewer that helps to get you to the imagery, land cover, and elevation data that I previously mentioned. And then I also want to highlight some of the trainings that we have available to folks as well. And there are quite a few when it comes to coastal adaptation that I wanted to highlight in terms of climate adaptation as well. And just a few resources that highlight here in the Great Lakes, Living on the Coast from the Wisconsin Sea Grant, as well as our SAGE trainings for adapting living shorelines into the Great Lakes. Oops. Sorry, each of those are hyperlinks for folks. I want to touch briefly on the Digital Coast Act, which was supported by Senator Baldwin, and it did pass in 2020. That allows us to really hone in on filling data gaps, developing publicly available data and tools, and providing greater focus on underserved areas, and as well as documenting best practices in product and service delivery. And lastly, I just want to touch on the power of partnerships in the Great Lakes, because I don't want to steal any thunder from Matt Doss. I know he's coming up to present, but it really has been beneficial for us to work with the various organizations and through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and getting a lot of our work done to improve resiliency in the Great Lakes. And so I just want to leave a final couple of thoughts for you all to think about, is considering the cost of inaction and what additional costs come in the future if we don't do anything. And then with the fact that we need to be thinking about moving from reactionary to proactive when it comes to climate resilience in our coastal communities. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I appreciate the time.
Well, thank you, Brandon. That was just incredible information. And I just want to remind everybody that we can find these webinars on the website, because I know there's a lot of those maps that I want to go back to, and we will be able to have the time to look into that information. And thank you for spreading the message too. We have to take care of this now. Because it's not going to get any better if we don't. So I know more people will have questions for you later. If you do have a question now, you could put it in the chat, but in the meantime, we're going to move on to our next speaker. I'm pleased to introduce to you Mr. Eric Brown, who serves as the Senior Advisor for External Relations at the Great Lakes Commission. In that capacity, Eric works with elected and appointed officials and with key agencies and organizations at the state, local, and federal levels. Prior to joining the commission, he lived and worked in Washington, D.C., serving variously for a governor, a member of Congress, and a private sector lobbying firm. In all of these roles, he worked diligently to protect the environmental and economic health of the Great Lakes region. Eric has a long history of convening state, provincial, and congressional leadership to build consensus around some very difficult issues, including ballast water standards, maritime transportation infrastructure investment, and invasive species management. He has a bachelor's degree in political theory and constitutional democracy from Michigan State University's James Madison College, and lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Eric has been a helpful partner to the GLLC in the past, and we're pleased that he could be here today to tell us a little bit about his continuing efforts of the Great Lakes Legislative Commission to promote climate resilience in coastal communities. So thank you so much, Eric, for joining us today.
Thank you, Senator, for the very generous introduction. I'm really glad to be here again to talk to you all about some of the stuff that the Great Lakes Commission is up to. And I really appreciate Brandon's presentation, because I know, we're all, getting up to speed on this stuff, but it's really heartening to know that NOAA and, other agencies on both sides of the Canada-US border are really, helping to put together the data, monitoring, and science and forecasting that I know you all will need to help inform the decisions that you're making when you're making policy decisions in your states and provinces. So with that, I will do my best to share the screen here. It's always a bit of an adventure. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Well, as Senator Fine mentioned, I'm Eric Brown. I handle external relations for the Great Lakes Commission. In that capacity, I also help to coordinate our policy and advocacy program, and I have the privilege of facilitating our standing committee on climate resilience. Before I get into that, I will give you all a little bit of a background on the Great Lakes Commission. I know that several of you are familiar with us, but for those of you who may not have worked with us, just want to give you all a little bit of background. We are a public agency established by an interstate compact called the Great Lakes Basin Compact of 1955. And that is in all of your state law in the Great Lakes states. So 8 Great Lakes states passed that compact into law in the 50s and 60s. And in 1968, Congress provided its consent to the interstate compact. So we are in both state and federal law. Ontario and Quebec officially joined as associate members in 1999 through a declaration of partnership. So we are a binational interstate compact agency. That's a mouthful, but we sort of sit between in this interesting space between the federal and state governments. So we help to coordinate policy and programs within the region. We are a non-regulatory agency, so we are an advisory agency in nature. And this allows our member states and provinces to come together, use the GLC as a forum, and speak with a unified voice and reach consensus on issues of interest, concern, and opportunity throughout the Great Lakes Basin. We are made up of commissioners from each of the jurisdictions. Depending on the enabling law in your jurisdiction, you have either 3 or 5 commissioners. They are appointed in various different ways, but we have folks who are appointed by governors. We have members of state legislatures. Some of you are on this call right now. Thank you to our commissioners who are joining us. We have cabinet level folks within the states and also representatives of industry and environmental NGOs. We have a board of directors, which is made up of 1 head of delegation from each jurisdiction. They meet monthly, so we have a very active board. We are currently chaired by Todd Ames of Wisconsin, who is the recently retired deputy secretary of the Wisconsin DNR. And we have a professional staff based in Ann Arbor, where I'm sitting today. Getting into some of the commission's work on climate resilience, I think we are on a similar timeline to you all at the Legislative Caucus, where we know that our federal agency partners have been working on monitoring and forecasting the effects of a changing climate on the basin for many years. I think from the policy perspective, we're playing a little bit of catch up. And so we really got into this space in late 2019 at the Commission's most recent in-person meeting in Quebec City. Just a note, we're hoping to meet in person again this summer in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So we'll share information on that. But there was an effort by some of our commissioners to step into the space of climate change and climate resilience more actively through the introduction of a resolution. There was a lot of discussion and debate, as you can imagine, around what the commission should do with respect to climate change issues. And I think in a moment of, consensus building and, open minds, they decided to stand up a special committee on climate resilience to determine ways that the commission could work together to scope out an effort related to climate change that could be supported unanimously by the commission and that would be, that would help to inform the work of the commission going forward. So through a fairly intensive 3-month process, the Special Committee on Climate Resilience developed a framework for action that it presented to the rest of the commissioners in January 2020 to help establish the work of the commission in this space going forward. It was a series of 7 recommendations, which included establishing a standing ongoing committee for climate resilience to develop a definition, to understand jurisdictional efforts related to climate resilience that have been in place or are planned for the near future, and to begin work on developing an action plan. So in January 2020, the GLC adopted the framework for action, stood up the Standing Committee on Climate Resilience, and began the work through the rest of the year to really start at the beginning and define resilience for the Great Lakes Basin so that the Great Lakes commissioners could work from the same baseline. After that, we worked with some partners from NOAA to develop goals for our action plan through a logic model process. We were offered a bit of a crash course on developing recommendations through a logic model. And since then, we've been working fairly regularly and fairly intensively as a commission and as a committee to develop an action plan that we hope will A, inform the work of the GLC going forward on climate resilience, and B, help us to work with external partners and, help to be, a coordinator of sorts or a collaborating hub to help the different levels of government work together and sort of coordinate efforts. In the fall of 2021, the commission finally got around to its resolution on climate change, which was passed unanimously at our annual meeting that was held virtually. That's all available on our website, and I'll share links to all of this with Mike, and he can send that out to you all. So that was a big step forward for the GLC working on climate. And right now we are working to finalize a draft action plan that we have been seeking stakeholder feedback on right now. And we hope to adopt it at our semi-annual meeting in June. I mentioned earlier that we started by defining resilience for the Great Lakes Basin, for the purposes of the GLC. I won't read it off to you, it's on your screen, but I just want to capture sort of the essence of it. You'll see it's very broad. And, the committee members recognized that a lot of the work that is already ongoing with respect to ecosystem restoration, to habitat restoration, infrastructure investment, the needs of communities throughout the Great Lakes and economic needs are all impacted by resilience and impact the resilience of the Great Lakes Basin. So you'll see that it's very broad and wide ranging. And the main themes of it have helped to focus the committee's goal development process going forward. So for our draft action plan, we've really organized our thinking around 4 main goals, and they relate to the health and resilience of individuals and communities, buildings and infrastructure, ecosystems, and the economy. When we look at healthy and thriving and resilient individuals and communities, the committee recognized that individuals and communities face significant and varied challenges from the impacts of climate change, and that two-way information sharing was going to be a really important factor in how we move forward with making recommendations around climate resilience. So, active listening to the needs of communities who are facing these impacts on a daily basis, and also, incorporating their ideas into the solutions that these many state agencies and provincial agencies would employ. So the committee recommends utilizing existing or creating new forums to help do this. Moving on to buildings and infrastructure, I think this category is definitely a more known and defined universe of opportunities and challenges. I know that, of course, at the federal level in Congress and the administration have been focused on infrastructure investment as they were developing the infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure law that's now being rolled out. And that you all in the states are thinking quite a bit about this as the funds and programs are starting to be, the guidance is released and the funding will be made available to you all. With that historic investment in infrastructure, I think, we really see this as an opportunity to implement resilient strategies for the long term. And the committee recognized the opportunities related to, share expertise and best practices with respect to infrastructure investment that is more resilient. The committee is focused really on 3 primary areas in respect to buildings and infrastructure. The first is coastal infrastructure, which you all have heard a lot about today. And you'll hear more, I know, from Matt and the Cities Initiative, because they're doing a lot of great work in this area. And we're happy to have the Cities Initiative participate through our standing committee. So we've focused on the Army Corps of Engineers Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study as an important tool to help inform policy decisions going forward. And we also look to the Cities Initiative and their ongoing efforts to, assess the needs of coastal communities and to establish workshops that I know Matt will tell you about to help implement some of these strategies. The committee also is looking at navigation on the lakes as an area where infrastructure investment could contribute to resilience. We all have been feeling the recent supply chain challenges, which really highlight the need to invest in our maritime infrastructure. And we recognize that the region has a distinct geographic advantage as a logistics hub. So we need to ensure that, as we invest in that infrastructure, that we do so in a way that helps it function reliably in all conditions. And then finally, last but not least, with respect to infrastructure, the committee is very focused on the need for investment in water infrastructure throughout the region. That's obviously been a focus for you all for several years now. And harnessing the new funding through the state revolving funds, through WIFIA and other programs to upgrade regional water infrastructure presents another opportunity. I'm pleased that my colleague, Nicole Zaccarda at the Great Lakes Commission has been helping to facilitate the development of an infrastructure blueprint to help Great Lakes jurisdictions guide their future investments. We're working on that right now. We hope to release that in the coming months. We think it'll be a great tool for you all. I know that many of you at the Legislative Caucus are familiar with Nicole's work as she helps facilitate and develop a Burkholz Institute around nutrient pollution. So you can expect that that'll be a great product coming out of the Great Lakes Commission very soon. Moving on to ecosystems, we heard a lot about that from Brandon earlier, and you all don't need to be reminded that ecosystems really define our region both geographically and culturally, and I think spiritually as well. And that recognizing that monitoring, management, and restoration and protection of natural systems on a watershed scale is even more important in the face of changing conditions. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this one because you heard a lot of great and frankly better and more detailed information from Brandon earlier. But I will say that through our work at the GLC and through the Committee on Climate Resilience, that we've focused on the need to share best practices and secure additional federal investment to help coordinate these efforts on a watershed scale. We know that random acts of resilience could be maybe good for a specific locality, but may have knock-on effects in other areas of a lake or other throughout the system that we want to make sure that we're taking into account. So making sure that shoreline planning, development, and management is more on that lake-wide scale or on a basin-wide scale, and is coordinated or at least thought about in that way. And then our last main goal is with respect to the economy. And I should have mentioned at the top, these are not in any particular order. We recognize that these four main goals are all of equal importance, and that they all relate to one another. You all know the importance of the Great Lakes to our regional economy. It helps to sustain, a $6 trillion economy on both sides of the Canada-US border. Taken alone, that would be the third largest economy in the world. And we recognize that the communities and natural resources of the Great Lakes are really central to the regional economy. The GLC, along with partners in the region, recently released a Blue Economy Action Plan that can help to guide future work in this space. And we recognize that there are additional opportunities to work with to learn from and work with private sector entities on both needs and best practices related to resilience. So we hope to facilitate dialogue that helps to share these, share that knowledge and potentially support some regional cluster development around resilient economic development. We also recognize that there are some goals or items that cut across all four of the things that I just mentioned. And I know Matt will get into a little bit of this as well. Capacity building is something that we really see as an area of need throughout the region. This is something that the committee continually came back to when we were working on each of those goals. And we're already seeing the Great Lakes community begin to address this need. A notable example being the city's initiative, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that in a moment. I think the GLC could also provide assistance in this area through sharing of best practices and development of blueprints, helping to support workshops, and we want to be complementary to the ongoing work throughout the region with respect to capacity building. Data and evaluation obviously is a big factor as well. You heard a lot about that from Brandon, so I can skip through this pretty quickly. But the committee has also sort of recognized the need to understand what's out there and identify gaps in knowledge. So we are working through a partnership with the University of Michigan to develop an interactive resource library that will help to expand the reach of a lot of the tools and resources that are in existence today, but also to identify some knowledge gaps that the states could potentially address with future policy. That's not live yet. We are working to build that, but we hope to have that released to the world sometime soon. And then, of course, accountability and measuring progress. The The Great Lakes states and provinces have tasked the GLC to help facilitate the development of goals and metrics related to a number of goals and issue areas throughout the Great Lakes. Lake Erie algae and aquatic invasive species are a couple of big areas where we've done this work through the Blue Accounting platform, which I know we've demoed to you all and have received a lot of important feedback from the Legislative Caucus on how to better provide these, data and, display the progress toward the achievement of goals. So thank you for that. The committee recommends using the Blue Accounting platform to help, do the same for climate resilience. And so to develop metrics, to set goals, and then measure our progress toward it. So that's the quick overview of where we are going. I've put my contact information up on screen and Mike will share it. I think, one thing that we're seeking from you all is feedback on, where, how we can help to utilize this action plan and utilize the Great Lakes Commission, as a forum to help inform the policy decisions that you all are making on a regular basis. And we want to be able to work with you all to provide the information that you need, and also provide access to your peers throughout the region, outside of the legislative sphere, but, in this broader Great Lakes stakeholder universe to, help make sure you all are connected and that we're all talking to each other as we work on these issues that have a lot of overlap and require a lot of coordination. So I'll leave it at that, Mike. And if there's anything else that you all want to know about with respect to the GLC's effort, happy to take questions after the presentation's finished.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. We really appreciate your participation this morning. And Senator Fine had another commitment she had to move on to. So with that, I'm just going to say thank you for the moment. For those of you who may have questions for either of our first two presenters, please hang on to those. We're coming up to an opportunity to have some discussion shortly, but first we're going to hear from our final presenter, and I'll turn it over to Senator Dave Senjum to make the necessary introduction. Senator.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Eric. I think all involved in this presentation today are looking forward to seeing that final plan and certainly working with GLC on moving it forward in whatever way we can help. So our final guest this morning is Mr. Matt Doss, who serves as a U.S. Policy Director with the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, where he manages the organization's policy and advocacy activities with Congress and federal agencies. And Matt also works with mayors, federal agencies, and regional partners on key priorities for the Great Lakes cities, including coastal resilience, water infrastructure modernization, Great Lakes restoration, invasive species prevention, waterfront revitalization, and related issues. So, prior to joining the Great Lakes Cities Initiative, he worked for the Great Lakes Commission for 25 years. He also worked for an environmental consulting firm and for a member of Congress. Matt is a Michigan native, currently living in Ann Arbor, and like Eric, he has been a helpful partner for GLLC. So we're very, very grateful he can join us today and fill us in on the climate resilience efforts of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. Matt, welcome, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Senator. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen and bring up my presentation. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. It's great to be here and really appreciate the good work that the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus does. And I'm thrilled to be following my good friends, Eric Brown and Brandon Krumriede. Both the Great Lakes Commission and NOAA are really important partners for us, so it's great to be here with them. Just a little bit of background on the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. We are a binational coalition of U.S. and Canadian mayors working to advance the protection and restoration of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River. We were formed in 2003 by the then mayors of Chicago and Toronto. and over the years have grown to be a pretty large coalition of mayors working on a variety of issues of interest to shoreline communities. Some of our kind of priorities in recent years have been securing COVID relief support for municipalities, water equity, water infrastructure funding, and coastal resilience. So you can see the map there with our members. Again, we have members in all 8 of the Great Lakes states and both the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec. And we are a bilingual organization, so all of our events and most of our publications are translated into French. I want to recognize 2 of my colleagues who are here with us today. Phil Murphy-Riom, who is my counterpart in Canada, our Canadian policy director, and my colleague Bridget Brown, who just started with us a couple weeks ago. So glad to have them here. So just quickly, a couple observations about coastal resilience challenges, and Brandon touched on this in far more detail and competence than I can, but just to note that some of the challenges that we face are the variability in water levels. There's a sort of a natural cycle of highs and lows, but with climate change, we're seeing those fluctuations happening more frequently and in greater severity, reaching higher highs and lower lows. And we talked about the low water levels about 10 years or so ago, and then in the last couple of years, historically high lake levels. We're also seeing damage from these high lake levels in particular in combination with more frequent and severe storm events and wave action. We're seeing greater erosion and flooding along shoreline areas. So you can see just a couple examples of those in these pictures here, in particular affecting property owners and municipal infrastructure along shorelines. And some of those threats, again, are erosion and flooding that threaten public and private properties and infrastructure. So our members, Great Lakes cities along the shoreline, are really on the cutting edge. They're sort of the front lines of this challenge. So this has been a major priority for us in recent years. So starting a couple of years ago, particularly during the height of those high water levels, we started to focus pretty intently on coastal resilience and have developed sort of a coastal resilience program with a number of priorities that you can see here, including research that I'll touch on in a little bit more detail in a moment, strategy, including our Mayor's Advisory Council on Coastal Resilience, advocacy with the US and Canadian federal governments regarding funding and technical support for municipalities, education and outreach, and then implementation, working with shoreline communities and mayors and their staff to identify solutions for shoreline problems, help them develop those projects and secure funding for them. So one of the first things we did a couple of years ago was we started to work more intently in this area was we kind of realized that we really wanted to understand more what the needs were among shoreline communities, among our mayors and other shoreline municipalities. So we developed a regional needs assessment survey and implemented it last year. And that went out to, we had about 300 responses to the survey. It went out broadly in both the US and Canada to local municipalities, both cities, counties, townships, other levels of government, other public agencies in shoreline areas such as port authorities and park districts. We had about 300 responses from around 250 specific municipalities. And you can see the results here really showing the high level of concern about coastal issues and the increasing level of interest in addressing coastal issues. So not a big surprise there given the impacts with high levels that we were seeing a few years ago. Some of the top concerns, again, not a huge surprise here, were shoreline and bluff erosion, flooding and high lake levels, infrastructure damage, and storm frequency. We found that funding for mitigation projects and planning is a high priority for our communities, but the existing funding opportunities are not meeting this need for most communities. And they noted the support from state, provincial, and federal agencies is very important to our communities, but the current level of support is not meeting their needs. So this was really kind of a foundation for us to help understand what the needs are, where the gaps are, and what more we could do in collaboration with other entities. I do want to note that we do plan to repeat this survey annually now. We're getting ready to put out a new survey. And so we hope that this will be a continuing source of information in the region about needs facing local municipalities. One of the other things that we looked at in the survey was the kind of funding or spending that shoreline municipalities are spending on shoreline issues, as well as what they expect to spend in the next 5 years. So one of the top line findings was that US municipalities are expected or projecting to spend almost $2 billion over the next 5 years. And our Canadian colleagues are expecting to spend about $250 million. So basically, almost $2.25 billion in spending on coastal needs is expected in the next 5 years. And that just shows you the magnitude of the needs and challenges they're facing. And this is probably an underrepresentation of the actual needs, since we obviously didn't have responses from every shoreline municipality. So moving forward, building on these needs that we identified, we formed a Mayor's Advisory Council on Coastal Resilience at the beginning of 2021 to really convene our mayors, field practitioner, and researchers to explore and prioritize the most pressing coastal needs and develop recommendations for the US and Canadian federal governments and our states and provinces. Those specific recommendations were just recently approved by the Advisory Council. So we're pulling those together into a report right now that we expect to have out within the next month. So you'll see announcements of that, and I'll make sure that this gets distributed to the members of the caucus. But some of the recommendations are falling into areas related to resources and funding needs, data and information gaps, strengthening coordination and collaboration among all levels of government and between public and private entities, and generally elevating coastal resilience as a priority across the basin. So these recommendations, again, have been finalized and will be formally released within the next month. And then over the coming year, we're going to be developing sort of implementation plans for those specific recommendations to carry them forward. One of the things that we're doing in the implementation realm is forming regional coastal resilience work groups in our states to focus on helping municipalities to develop, identify solutions to coastal resilience needs, develop those projects, and basically develop implementation roadmaps to help get those projects funded. We're very excited about some significant resources coming down from the infrastructure bill, as well as other ongoing state and federal programs. So we think this is a really critical time for cities and other local municipalities to kind of get these projects developed, get them scoped out, and get them ready to propose for funding to advance them toward implementation. So we have started with pilot programs in Wisconsin, cities on Lake Michigan, and in Southeast Michigan, with support from the Fund for Lake Michigan and the Herb Family Foundation. The Wisconsin project is the furthest along. They've identified 60 potential projects in 13 communities, and they're currently narrowing those down to a subset of roughly one project per community. And again, the ultimate aim is to help support those communities in developing implementation frameworks for those projects to get them poised for funding applications. We are going to be expanding this work this year with support from a new grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation that will expand this work into Illinois, Indiana, West Michigan, and Minnesota and Wisconsin's communities on Lake Superior. So we're very excited about that. My colleague Bridget Brown is on today. She will be leading that work. And I also just want to recognize my colleague, Tori Graves, who's not on the webinar today, but Tori has taken the lead in a lot of our coastal resilience work, including the Mayor's Advisory Council that I mentioned earlier. Finally, getting into some of our advocacy priorities. Again, one of the roles of the city's initiative is to advocate on behalf of our member cities with the US and Canadian federal governments. So these are just some of the U.S. priorities that we'll be looking at this year. We just released our advocacy priorities last week. Those are on our website. On the U.S. side, we're going to continue to support the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is doing critical work to clean up and restore the Great Lakes, in particular those designated areas of concern where there's such a great opportunity for cleaning up legacy pollution and helping communities revitalize waterfront areas. The Army Corps of Engineers is a very important partner for us working on coastal issues. The Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study is getting up and running, and we hope to work with the Corps to make sure that that study really responds to the needs of shoreline communities. And the Corps has a number of other what they call their continuing authorities programs that provide support for shoreline projects. FEMA has a number of very important programs. The BRIC program was started a couple of years ago to provide support for mitigation projects for a variety of hazard mitigation risks, as well as there's ongoing hazard mitigation grant program. The STORM Act was just passed by Congress last year, and that program is being developed by FEMA now. Basically what that will do FEMA will provide grants to states to set up low interest revolving loan programs for local municipalities to implement hazard mitigation projects. So it's kind of similar to the clean water and drinking water SRF programs. The states will be administering those low interest loan programs. So it's probably going to be another year before that's up and running, but that could be a very important source of a low interest loan funding for shoreline municipalities. So definitely something that the states will want to look at. Finally, we've talked about NOAA, the important work of NOAA's Coastal Zone Management Program and the National Sea Grant Program. And then finally, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation has a National Coastal Resilience Fund, which is actually where our grant is from. And we're expecting to see some significant additional funding for that program soon. So encourage states and local municipalities to really, again, be prepared to take advantage of that new funding that's coming down in these various programs. So these are our Canadian priorities. And again, my colleague, Phil Murphy-Riom is on the line here and manages this in Canada. Canada is setting up a new Canada Water Agency that we think is going to be a very important focal point for working on these issues. Also supporting climate adaptation for coastal communities, including a joint office for shoreline and climate change adaptation, reinstating federal shoreline restoration funding for communities along the St. Lawrence Seaway, a national adaptation strategy, and a green infrastructure center of excellence at Infrastructure Canada. And then really, as always, we continue to encourage federal and provincial agencies to engage with local municipalities in the development of climate change adaptation tools and enabling municipalities to protect water quality for their communities. So again, that's just a quick overview of some of the priorities on the Canadian side of the border. And with that, I think I will finish up. And there's my contact information, and I'm happy to take questions either now or offline. And I look forward to working with everybody at the caucus as we move forward. So that's it for me. Thank you. Senator, would you like me to stop sharing my screen?
That would be great, Matt. Thank you.
There you go.
Senator Senjum, are you still with us?
I'm sorry.
There you go.
I was on mute. Thank you so much. We've got about 8 minutes left or so. Why don't we get into some questions? And why don't you just voice them out? You can put a hand up if you want on your screen, but in the essence of time and waiting for that, if you have one, speak now. Anyone? Let me just start. I've got just one. So there's a lot of activity by a lot of groups, government, GLC, on and on. is in the cities. Is there any need to coalesce around some larger group that just brings all these groups together? Is there any, the question really is there any risk to working in silos? And always more is better, I understand that, but should we be thinking in that kind of a direction? That is a larger super group to convene all these groups together.
Yeah, Senator, this is Eric Brown from the Great Lakes Commission. I think that's a really great question, and something that I know a lot of us have been wrestling with is, how do, this is such an important and urgent issue to deal with. And all of these different jurisdictions have, different inputs into it and different needs, of course. That's something that I think, as a region, we're starting to, almost organically create that sort of super group that you speak of. Through the Great Lakes Commission, we're coordinating with federal agencies, state legislators, and NGOs, things like that. So we're trying to help provide a little bit of that forum. But I think, what's important to also note is that we all sort of sit on each other's committees and groups. Like, I participate with the Legislative Caucus's work on this issue, and Mike sits on the Great Lakes Commission Standing Committee on Climate Resilience. And the same relationship exists between the Great Lakes Commission and the Cities Initiative as well. So I guess I'm pleased to report that we're already sort of organizing ourselves as best we can without creating.
Eric, why don't we just stop there, Eric, because I think we got the essence, and we've got Jennifer here with a question, and we're trying to pack them in as well as we can within just a couple of minutes. Jennifer French.
Yes, thank you. If everyone can hear me, we're good. Thank you to all the presenters, and also nice to see some of you again, or nice to see the faces of the people whose work I read. But I will say, just further to what Eric was saying, it's hard when I talk about the work of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus, and people are like, "Oh yeah, I was at that meeting," and I said, "No, you're thinking the city's initiative." So, we it's a real thing. I have a sort of a weird and wonky in the weeds question that has come up. Obviously, all of my colleagues on here have an opportunity to be lobbied by or learn from different folks. And a while ago, I had met with those responsible in Canada for nuclear waste. And one of the conversations that we had was quite interesting because of some of the work I've been doing with different folks in the science world about the wastewater that is heated. And I would argue that it's waste. But anyway, and I know that there are rules about the water from different industries that are put back into the Great Lakes. And this isn't a comment on whether it's clean or not. That's a whole separate thing. I'm talking about temperature. And I know that the plume or flume or whatever the word is about, that is set out into the lakes from different industries, not only nuclear, but a lot of us have those, massive heat producers along our shorelines. And it has to be so far out. My question is, when I see, as a person who lives along the lake and has a community that lives along the lake, when I see that it never freezes at the shoreline or seldom is frozen, that the percentage of, time that the water is ever actually frozen and therefore not evaporating. And when it's through the winter, we have so much more time for erosion. All of these things interconnected. Is there a conversation to be had? Because we as legislators, it's easy for us to suggest rules. So, and it's best that we not do it just rogue. I guess if there is anything that is coming along in terms of the erosion science, the heat, the growth of algae, all of that stuff that is exacerbated by warmer water, is there a role for us to play in terms of monitoring? Because it's not being collected, at least not here, that data. Just anyway, super in the weeds. But the weeds grow warmer or grow better in warmer water, and we have more of that.
To any of our presenters, that question. try to keep it relatively
Brandon, at the beginning, this is what got my wheels turning. So
yes. So what I will say is, yes, actually in satellite imagery, we can clearly see those heat plumes within the water and its dissipation along the shoreline. Obviously very much more prevalent in winter weather when we see those plumes, but certainly your question, I mean, we're starting to think about monitoring efforts that are needed in Lake Superior, you know, in regards to clitophora, zebra mussels. Again, warmer water temperatures. What does that do to the ecosystems? But then too, what risk does that provide in terms of supporting additional E. coli, you know, and water quality issues that are associated with that too. There are a lot of different issues at bay when you start thinking about water temperatures. And again, the lack of ice cover, the increase in erosion that we see now during the winter months as well. So I'm not aware of, you know, I'm not a water quality or chemist by any means, but certainly the evidence is there and we do see it in the data. So.
Thank you. And it's something that I would be quite interested when I talk to the science folks that are starting to really study the water temperature, but then the organizations that are created, like in Canada, that I'm forgetting the name of the organization, but that monitors nuclear waste. That isn't one of the criteria. That isn't a type of waste, right? So, and I don't know what that would look like to have to cool the water before you know, expel it or things like that. And it's just, if there were recommendations, I think that this group and other legislators would be the right people to start to ask questions or put things in motion to monitor things as it's not being measured. And I can't imagine it doesn't contribute. So thank you very much, Brandon.
Good. Thank you, Jennifer. We have maybe time for one real quick question. Is there one out there? Carlos.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I should say. I'm Carlos Leitao from the Quebec Legislative Assembly. Brandon, I would have a question. Perhaps it's an impossible question, and I understand that. And you mentioned, you know, the issues about the complexity of water levels, too high, too low, back to too high. But perspective as a scientist, which one would you say is a greater threat in the coming years? Water levels being too high or water levels being too low, or both at the same time, which will be even more complicated.
Brandon, you have about a minute.
I'll try and get it in 30 seconds. I think Matt hit it on the head. It's the rate at which we see these changes occurring to the too high to too low and how quickly those rates of changes are. That's what we're not accustomed to, and that's what we need to start thinking about moving forward.
Good, thank you.
Thank you so much, all. Thank you to our presenters today. Certainly thank you for our audience. It's been a fantastic informational opportunity I think we've all had. Certainly want to thank the Joyce Foundation, the Herb Foundation, and the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for making this work, making this event possible today. So with that, I have a great day and certainly a great weekend, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.